Gaze up at the night sky, and if you know where to look, you'll see the Centaurus constellation. 5 light years away is a reminder of a myth from closer to home, the constellation named after Chiron, king of the centaurs. The half-man, half-horse became a wise mentor to many Greek heroes, including Hercules and Achilles. Chiron suffered the cruel fate of being abandoned at birth. Eventually, he was adopted by Apollo, who taught Chiron many skills, including medicine, music, prophecy, poetry, and law. Chiron distinguished himself from other centaurs who were violent and impulsive by harmonizing primal instincts with reason and logic. Later in life, Chiron was accidentally struck by a poisoned arrow. While living in unbearable pain, Chiron's mastery of the healing arts was driven by a search for a cure for himself. While he never succeeded in healing himself, he brought comfort and healing to many others. And so the myth of the wounded healer was born, which later inspired Carl Jung's description of healing professionals whose wounds motivate them to serve others. The poet Rumi also spoke to the power of the wounded healer as a path to transformation when he said, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Only by examining our own wounds can we truly discover wholeness, the unique expression of this life, and what we are called to bring forth into the world to help others. However, befitting Greek mythology, that is a Herculean task. Like all archetypes, the wounded healer has its shadow polarities constellated within our inner universe, which can dim the light within the wound. This installment of Archetypes of Awakening will explore the delicate journey of psychological and emotional healing through the wounded healer's shadow polarities, victimhood and saviourhood. The passive shadow of victimhood is often rooted in shame and manifests as a resistance or complete refusal to examine one's own wounds. Unconsciously, the person may record evidence of their persecution, moaning about the state of the world and their problems, overlooking their responsibility and power to enact change, and how they contribute to dynamics and situations that cause pain. The active shadow of saviourhood is often rooted in pride, and manifests as a denial of one's own wounds and an exaggerated, sometimes delusional belief in one's ability to heal others. This may start as a desire to mask their wounds and regulate their pain by excessively attending to others' needs. Not only does this codependency act as a painkiller, it can inadvertently fuel the assumption the person they're trying to save is powerless. Like all archetypes, one polarity can swing to another. For example, someone caught in saviourhood may overextend themselves, leaving them exhausted and frustrated by the ingratitude of those they're trying to take care of, swinging them towards victimhood. Or someone caught in victimhood may project the role of victim onto others, swinging them into the saviourhood polarity. In undertaking this exploration, we seek not to minimize or negate the very real, visceral suffering many have experienced. Some people have been victims of horrific circumstances. Others, with great effort, have striven to alleviate the suffering of others in the role of helper. What we offer is a different perspective, one that aims to show how our wounds and the suffering they create can become pathologized, a problem to be fixed and contained instead of an opportunity for personal and systemic transformation. In an age of pathologized suffering, these polarities can manifest in the dynamic between psychiatrist and patient, where the patient may willingly hand over all responsibility for their healing to the expert point of view. In talking therapy, someone may expect their therapist to have all the answers and heal them, instead of using the support to cultivate inner resourcefulness. Unintentionally, a therapist or healing professional can fuel this dynamic by projecting woundedness onto the patient, safely compartmentalizing themselves as the healer. In the words of Jungian analyst Jane Clapp, saviour complexes in helping professions are occupational hazards that we must stay vigilant about so that we don't forget we are wounded healers. That is, humans coming together with another human to support them, not rescue them. If we forget our woundedness, we can unconsciously create power dynamics in the dyad that lead to states of inflation and false omnipotence. Pathologizing is intertwined with diagnosing. It is true that a diagnosis or label can validate suffering and cultivate self-compassion. And in some cases, such as some neurodivergent diagnoses, they may free the individual from the pathologization of their symptoms and affirm their unique expression of wholeness. But there is always a risk that a diagnosis becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy that stifles growth due to identification with perceived brokenness, especially when the disorder is explained as lifelong and incurable. As Jungian analyst and poet Marion Woodman said, "Healing means making whole, and very often in our culture, it's confused with curing, which brings in an outside medicine or surgery to interfere with the inner process. So as I see healing, it's allowing our psyche to work with us to bring wholeness to our being." The excessive pathologizing of mental health is based on an ever-narrowing definition of normal. Anything that falls outside of this range is considered abnormal. Echoing the pathologization of the feminine and its capacity to heal by the church and its male minions in the medieval witch trials, today, medical institutions and commercial pharmaceutical interests are gatekeepers to the definition of normal, and consequently, madness or insanity. Doctors and psychiatrists run the risk of becoming institutional minions by defending the top-down definition of normal as a fixed, objective truth. If you talk to God, you are praying. If God talks to you, you have schizophrenia, Thomas says. Anyone navigating the path of the wounded healer will find the burden of culture with them with every step and every corner turned. As we explored in Decoding the Artist Archetype, since the Age of Enlightenment, the rise of reason and the scientific method has disenchanted the world. With no space for the divine, increasingly religious or so-called supernatural experiences are viewed as delusions, psychosis, or more extreme, personality disorders, such as schizophrenia. We must ask, metaphorically, if God talks to you, are you mad? It's apt that Carl Jung's work was inspired by schizophrenic patients, drawing his research on the many symbols and myths that make up the infrastructure of the collective unconscious. In the documentary Crazy Wise, Phil Borges, a photographer who spent decades recording indigenous cultures, shares fascinating accounts of how tribal healers, visionaries, and shamans had experiences that closely matched Western models of madness prior to embodying their gift of healing. Borges astutely notes the influence of the medical approach to treating mental illness. We are now pathologizing the normal human experience. The list of disorders in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, written by the American Psychiatric Association, has grown by 300% since it was first published in 1952. The DSM is referenced as the Bible of psychiatric disorders. If so, pathologizing is its dogma. Worryingly, expanding concepts of mental illness gives authority to medicalize a wider net of experience. In 2016, Dr. Nick Haslam introduced concept creep theory to explain this phenomenon. Haslam outlines two axes of semantic inflation. Horizontal creep forms new categories with medications to match, whereas vertical creep results in the relaxation of diagnostic criteria. An extreme example of concept creep was illustrated by the backlash to the DSM including prolonged grief disorder to grief which lasts longer than 6 months, even if it followed the loss of a long-standing relationship. It is not insignificant to note that every disorder becomes fair game to treat pharmaceutically. In what must be an unfortunate coincidence, 60% of psychiatrists who contributed to the 2022 edition of the DSM received payments from Big Pharma. In the West, the so-called medicalisation of human experience has left us apprehensive and disconnected from the fullness of the inner world. Suffering must be contained or erased rather than, as Rumi suggested, seen as the beginning of a healing process, through which great potential and gifts can emerge. Although there is a growing movement to view mental health issues such as anxiety, depression, and complex trauma with more compassion and less stigma, the further reaches of the inner world are still misunderstood and feared. Non-ordinary states are marginalized as extremes beyond hope. The visionary is mad, the shaman crazy, the prophet deluded. While the wound is clear, the healer can be harder to find. For many, the immensity of suffering and the intrusive and unconventional nature of non-ordinary states is too much to bear. Suffering may be lifelong, symptoms forever managed. Many don't make it. This can't be overlooked. However, a revision of the cultural understanding of madness would go some way to giving more people hope and a better shot at finding the light in the darkest of times, including within their wounded experience. In Madness and Civilization, French philosopher Michel Foucault traces a historical account of madness. Foucault argued the idea of reason became synonymous with what kind of thought and behaviour was permissible. He believed reason had become institutionalized, and those who dissent are viewed as mad or irrational, and dealt with accordingly. He relates how in the Middle Ages, the view of madness in Europe was similar to indigenous tribes. Many saw the potential for wisdom, with fables and myths showing the madman as a truth teller. But in the 17th century, in what was known as the Great Confinement, masses of marginalized and social outcasts were institutionalized. Madness became heavily stigmatized, leading to the development of asylums in the 18th and 19th centuries. Foucault writes, "Madness is the false punishment of a false solution, but by its own virtue it brings to light the real problem, which can then be truly resolved." The false solution of excessive medicalisation reveals the real human problem of the zealousness and greed of profit-motivated, disenchanted industries capitalising on human suffering. Fortunately, many healers in the fields of psychology and psychiatry have refused to have blind faith in the Western model and dared to question. The evolution of humanistic and body-based psychologies offer a different perspective on symptoms which might otherwise be pathologized. The integration of the divine is evident in Jungian philosophy, transpersonal psychology, internal family systems, and more. Founders of holotropic breathwork, Stanislav and Christina Groth, argue many experiences that are labelled as psychosis and treated with suppressive medication are difficult stages of radical personality transformation and of spiritual opening. If understood and supported, these crises can result in psychosomatic healing, remarkable psychological transformation, and consciousness evolution. Suffering has to be embraced for transformation to occur, the opposite of suppression. It cannot be bypassed by embracing superficial spirituality. It requires great courage. Pioneer psychiatrist R.D. Laing captures the paradox of diving headfirst into perceived madness in his description of true sanity, where the normal ego, adjusted to society, dissolves. Spiritual emergency involves the emergence of inner archetypal mediators of divine power and the eventual re-establishment of a new kind of ego functioning, the ego now being the servant of the divine, no longer its betrayer. The emergence of divine power, the light which has emerged from within the wound, can lead to identity crisis and confusion. The birth of a new self, oriented in the divine, not disconnected but part of the universal whole, has stages of immense suffering. The dark night of the soul, Kundalini psychosis, the surfacing of trauma, activation of the inner eye, can all be further conflated with madness or mental health disorders, interfering with this process. Almost all spiritual traditions, East and West, contain examples of divine madness. Socrates breaks down divine madness into 4 categories, each associated with a specific god. Prophecy, the gift of Apollo. Mystical revelation and purification, the gift of Dionysus. Poetic inspiration, the gift of the Muses. And the madness of love, the gift of Aphrodite and Eros. The central paradox of the wounded healer is risking madness to discover sanity. If the person suffering and the support network around them stays true to the course without pathologizing or numbing, meeting the struggle with compassion, care, and patience, spiritual rebirth and transformation can occur. The divine within the madness may imbue life with a new sense of divinity and meaning. Fortunately, the path is paved, thanks to a unique perspective on a mythological journey known so well in the Western world. Whatever you believe about the life of Jesus Christ, the power of his archetypal narrative is undeniable, evoking a strong emotional and spiritual response for millennia. Christ's martyrdom in embracing his crucifixion and allowing himself to be wounded as a selfless, noble sacrifice transcends victim and saviourhood to reveal a higher purpose, to open the door to a new level of consciousness. Interestingly, the wounded healer's shadow polarities can attach to the blueprint of the latter stages of the story. Fixation on the crucifixion amplifies the sense of victimhood and purposeless suffering. Fixation on the resurrection amplifies the sense of saviourhood by spiritually bypassing the required descent, which is essential for both humility and wholeness. What is missing is what happens between the crucifixion and resurrection. Referencing Rudolf Steiner's greatest spiritual event of our time, in his book Undreaming Wetiko, author and Tibetan Buddhist practitioner Paul Levy highlights how, mirroring the shamanic journey, between Christ's crucifixion as symbolic of the recognition of suffering, and resurrection as symbolic of the integration of wholeness, there was a descent into the underworld. In this archetypal domain, the wounded healer comes face to face with the duality of light and dark, heaven and hell, good and evil. Christ's confrontation with his polar opposite, the Antichrist, was essential for his transformation. It's perhaps no coincidence that evil is live backwards. Levy explains this as a call to action which, when embraced, activates transpersonal forces. Although at first glance this encounter can be fear-inducing, the redeeming quality is the realization that the darkness is inferior to the force of light, be that of awareness, compassion, love, or curiosity. Christ's story is an enduring reminder that although now used as a cynical cliche, love and light is a blueprint etched into the fabric of the cosmos, the medicine required to overcome hatred and the perception of darkness. Indeed, Christ's archetypal journey may be the only way to overcome what Native Americans called Wetiko, a contagious psychospiritual disease of the soul currently being acted out en masse on the world stage via an insidious collective psychosis of titanic proportions. This mind virus covertly operates through the unconscious blind spots in the human psyche, rendering people oblivious to their own madness and compelling them to act against their own best interest. The collective psychosis of Wetiko is the polar opposite of divine madness. Rather than a gift of the gods that fuels inspiration or service, Wetiko is a life-suffocating impulse that gravitates towards fear, isolation and regression, often defending consensus reality even when its deviance is plain to see. For us, we don't have to reenact the story of Christ in its extremes, but understand it archetypally. Carl Jung phrased this another way when he said, "The hero's main feat is to overcome the monster of darkness. It is the long hoped for and expected triumph of consciousness over the unconscious." We can embark on this hero or heroine's journey by recognizing our suffering as a signal of an underlying sense of separation, a wounded experience from our past that remains unintegrated, inquiring into the suffering to meet our fears and recognize the dismembered and fragmented parts of self which have become distorted while hidden in the shadow. Being willing to give up an old identity, belief, ideology, relationship, long-established goals, or even basic comforts to embrace and reintegrate these parts into a new constellation of wholeness. We can look to another archetype for help, the midwife. The French word for midwife, sage-femme, translates to wise woman. The wounded healer is a psychic midwife who embraces the wisdom of the feminine, deep intuition and sensing, to embrace and transform one's own suffering. Once sufficiently familiar with birthing a new self, the wounded healer, as psychic midwife, can support others through a similar process while continuing to work on themselves. In short, the wisdom of her wounded experience and healing is her medicine. To integrate the wounded healer archetype, balance must be found between owning one's gifts and highest possibilities without succumbing to delusions of grandeur, between confronting wounds responsibly without being overwhelmed or over-identified with those wounds. As you embrace the healer within, one step at a time, Allow yourself to gaze up at the night sky, to be inspired by the noble calls of helping others, never forgetting the importance of helping yourself, never forgetting each of us has the ability to heal, never forgetting the wound is where the light enters you.